physicians in the process. And so kind of forming that coalition, I think, is a successful. And I think with healthcare reform being the urgency to make a change, we sort of, the urgency in general is set. And then getting this group of physicians who are engaged is something that has been done well, or is being done well.
What do you? I'll bring it down to a more specific point. Take the idea of what the ALP graduate track has to do with in terms of language of caring. Language of caring is something we're pushing out across the system. It's a big change. We're trying to change physician behavior. We're trying to change how we interact with physicians and patients, and how physicians react with other physicians, and how interactions are. How much urgency have we instilled as a group into that process?
Hi, this is Doug Cutler. It's timely. I was just at Del Webb the other day. I think it's variable. At some places, I think at MD Anderson in Houston, it was mandatory for their 1,300 physicians to go through the program. And I think we're having, we're struggling with how do we get our physicians to be involved. We're probably only requiring it of our contracted and employed physicians at this point. But I think that's an example where we may be a little timid.
Yeah, this is Judy Wolf. I would say at MD Anderson, the difference is all 1,300 physicians are employed.
Well, there you go.
And so it is easier. You're right. So I think we have to think of a way that, to engage physicians who aren't contracted or employed by figuring out how to make it important enough to them.
Yeah, so I guess going back to this, I mean, it's, we need to get others aligned and, aligned to the vision, communicate that vision. But really, I still think in a lot of ways we struggle to do the first step. We struggle to create the urgency for why this is even important to begin with. I think physicians, relative to most other groups, tend to fight change more than most. And I think they have to have a pretty good reason for change. They hate being told what to do, and it's one of those where I think that's a big step that we need to still work on within that process.
This is Ann. This is a little bit of a sidebar, but I bristled a bit at reading, create a sense of urgency. And perhaps it was just semantic, but it irritated me a bit as being perhaps disingenuous. If there's really not a crisis, why do we create a crisis mode? And I thought, how would I rewrite it? And I would say sort of a genuine enthusiasm, and of course, always, what's in it for me, for everybody in your audience, for what it's worth.
Good point.
But I do think it has to be what's in it for me to get people to engage in the language of caring. And, if they're going to get less money, or they're going to be embarrassed. I mean, it's going to be public information. Physicians also like to be very successful and be seen positive. And if it's out there to the known world that your patient experience scores as an individual, even if it's not really individual, are poor, and this is a way to make them better, it might be a way to engage people. Except the thing that irritates me about both of those things is those are both sticks, not carrots.
Right.
I think, this is Betty Davis, I think that with the point on establishing a sense of urgency, I don't know how well Banner has done that. Maybe they've done it differently in different locations. But in Sun City West, I would love to see something that says, okay, this is what ACA is all about. This is an ACO. This is why we need to do this. And I know they've had some meetings like that, but make it, because the ACO or because there's Obamacare now, this is a law, it's a tax. These are things that we have to do. If we don't do this, if this is what happens. If we don't comply with this, this is what happens. So that physicians can understand it better. And also, I think so many people put the blame on, they say, oh, Banner's making me do this, or Banner's making me do this. They would kind of understand that it's not just Banner. You know, when I go to my meetings that are in other states, everybody's doing this, you know, and I try and tell people that it's not just Banner, but I don't think they've done a great job of kind of giving a synopsis of what's happened in the last 6 years with healthcare.
But have physicians been asleep? I mean, really? How could you not already know that?
Well,
I guess. And you may be right, but to me, like, that's like a duh.
Yeah, I think that still there's a lot of people, a lot of physicians who blame the corporation as opposed to blame things that are happening in legislative processes.
So, again, it kind of urgency, for me, I would kind of put urgency in communicating a sense of urgency almost to what crowd are you speaking to and understanding, you know, kind of what motivates people. And I don't think most organizations or many folks have understood what motivates doctors. I think there's a lot of, in my opinion, false impressions of what motivates physicians, and I believe that needs to change. I think physicians need to remember what motivated them to begin with half the time. And part of that communication of urgency needs to be what crowd are you speaking to, which is why I think an effort led by physicians towards physicians will likely be more successful than one that's run via non-physicians.
This is Mary Samfroka. I think that's a good point, and I think there's a subtlety involved in that in terms of when you finished your training and by default kind of how old you are. I think that physicians who finished their training many years ago really were trained much differently. Their views of what their life was going to be like was much different than the kids that are coming out now. And I think that their expectations were different, and what they want out of their practice is much different than physicians who are coming out now.
And I think, Mary, this is Judy, that if you think about, you know, motivated by money versus motivated by lifestyle is one thing, but I think something that cuts across all is motivated to take care of patients. And if we could refocus everyone on doing what's best for the patient and the greater good, and not whether your lifestyle is better or whether you're making more money, those are really the doctors that we want to be part of Banner Health. And I think that does cross generations.
But I think there's also a difference, not just in lifestyle or money expectations. There's also, personally, I think there's a difference in decision-making expectations. And so physicians that came out 20 years ago really thought of themselves as entrepreneurs, and they were going to dictate their own destiny. Where I think physicians that are coming out now are more acclimated to there's a lot of things beyond our control that we are being pushed to change, whether we really approve of those changes or not. I think there's more of an acceptance that you have to find a way to make it work because it's coming whether you like it or not. Where older physicians, I don't think, have that same acceptance.
Well, it's very interesting. When I was in graduate school, we talked a lot about how change comes about in research breakthroughs. And it's actually the people at the beginning of their career and the end of the career that are most likely to be willing to step off the edge and a change occurs. So it may be more the mid-career people who are stuck in that, not wanting to change. And if we focus on the young physicians and the older ones, because they have less to lose, it might be a way to buy in the people in the middle.
Mm-hmm. Hey, that's an amazing observation. This is Sheldon in Colorado. We do an annual physician engagement survey because if you don't know, we're a leased facility. Banner tried to buy the hospital and the city doesn't want to sell it. So Banner leases it, and that requires us to do it every single year physician satisfaction survey. And when we cut last year's along ages, it was just what you said. And our interpretation, probably flawed, but we had fun with it, is that the young docs are just so excited, and no matter how bad it is, they've got a long time to fix it. So they were very positive. The middle group was really sour. And we weren't sure why the older group was not as happy as the young group, but getting happy, kind of like, hey, I can stick out anything. It's only a few more years, but I don't have as much to lose. So I think there's a lot of truth in what you said in why and who we may want to approach first.
Hey, it's Dr. Khan. I just want to share a few comments with you. By the way, great articles, and thanks for sharing that. About the leading change, I just want to, I read an article not too long ago about an author goes by the name Jay Conger, and I think it was probably in HBR as well. And he tied this leading change. I mean, a lot of you mentioned that, does the responsibility goes on the participants or the managers in an organization, in that case the doctors, since we're pretty much running that or be a part of it, or is that shared with the organization itself? And one of the interesting points was that Jay Conger brought about was that what is referred to as succession planning and leadership development. And he referred that as like it's the two sides of the same coin. And a lot of companies, and let's just say Banner, they managed to do pretty good about what to do with the organization, but there's not a lot of succession planning in terms of, getting that leadership pipeline, which I think the Banner is in the right direction, because there is physician presence at pretty much all levels from top down. And working in that leadership pipeline should be the focus on development. And one of the key aspects that was mentioned is to identify those linchpin positions which will actually feed into that pipeline. We shouldn't be in a situation where all of a sudden you have to look for who's going to fill this key important position. So we have, I'm glad going through the ALP, a lot of physicians got on board by what the vision for Banner is, and we kind of spread that word around, getting to know the physicians who will be more willing to be a part of that leading change. Unless we move forward and we get these people on board, that's going to be a hard task. But I think at the same time, Banner as an organization have to invest in the resources to not only find out what the focus on development is, but also it has to be more of a transparent process, because this whole process has to be lined up with what are how to identify a star potential in an organization. And we've been talking about a scorecard or how to measure different performances. But I think there has to be a way of tying that up with the people who will have the potential to lead and bring that change. So I felt I'll just share that with you.
Thanks, Abrar. I guess what you're alluding to is what is the way that you identify those leaders that are better at leading change? Again, distinguishing leaders from managers and distinguishing leaders from good leaders and leaders that are really change champions. And I don't know. I don't know. Does anybody know what Banner's way or method or is?
Hi, this is Therese Valadez. I'm one of the sponsors, and I'm a Chief Human Resource Officer for Banner Medical Group. And one of the things, as Albert was talking about, we do have a process that's still relatively new in my eyes at Banner, which is a talent management review process, where we do identify physicians that are showing leadership capabilities, and we then look at what are the developmental opportunities. And obviously one of these opportunities is the Advanced Leadership Program, to be able to prepare them for future roles within Banner as leaders. So there is a process, and how they're identified is either through their physician leader and or their administrative partners that are part of the group that they are in, either within the hospital or within the medical group.
But then I would say that part of our job as physician leaders is not only to identify but to mentor people who might become future leaders, and that we have to take the onus on ourselves, not let anybody else try to figure it out, because I think sometimes we get so busy doing our own job we forget that part of our job is to bring the others up.
And I totally agree with that. Mentoring is a very important part of developing a strong leader.
Great. I want to talk about one other point here. Cotter's written this other book. It's called Our Iceberg is Melting, and it's a fable, and it goes through a story of these penguins that live on an iceberg, and this one penguin named Fred who identifies that the iceberg is melting, and he has through, he goes through all these steps and essentially has to convince his entire group of penguins to move to a different iceberg. It's a big change. Everything is happening. Everything is changing, and it kind of really shows, pictorially, what it is that's needed to lead this change. I'd really recommend everybody to read it. You can read it in half a day. But one of the things that comes through there is, again, back to urgency, and to your point, I think the big thing here is I think we're talking about transformational change. I don't think this is change in, day to day. This is not a change that's minor. I think we're talking about change that really changes how we act and how we feel and how we behave as an organization. And I think that does take a lot of urgency, and that does take a lot of communication of where it is that we're going. And in my opinion, it's still lacking. It's lacking quite a bit across healthcare and even within our organization. I know Banner as a whole has done a lot to tell us where we're going, what's happening, and that's fantastic. That's what's needed. But I think we need more. I still think we need more efforts like that and less effort sort of up front on what it is we're going to do and more effort on why is it that we're going to do it. And I really feel that's how we're going to get more employees and especially physicians engaged. Because, like I said, I feel that most physicians are cynical and skeptical about change, and more than other specialties at times. So what are you guys' thoughts on more efforts?
So, Shiva, Sheldon, one of the things I think that is really critical in what we're accomplishing when we just, I don't know if it's always, it's hard to tell sometimes, I think, when you're mentoring somebody, because if you're consciously trying to mentor somebody, obviously that may take or it may not take, but at least you know it. But I think the really shocking thing is that there's people watching all of us in these leadership roles, and sometimes we don't even know they're watching us, and you're mentoring whether you know it or not. And I think when you look at these curves that people have created as models to understand why change happens or doesn't, it's the early adopters. Well, let me rephrase this. It's the innovators who, are in high school, nobody wanted to eat lunch with them because they're weirdos, and if you were seen with them, you're toast. But the early adopters were always interested in those people, and they talked a little bit to them. And the early adopters were the first ones to implement their ideas. And then there's the middle adopters who really, I hate to say it, but they need somebody to convince them. And that's, I think, the largest number of folks. And that's who we're either mentoring or just role modeling for. They're resistant. They're not going to follow. They see one of you do it, and they go, you know what? They have integrity, and I respect them. I don't always agree with them, but I respect them. And if they're doing that, I'm not sure I'm in, but I'll give it a try. And that's what actually creates, change in any organization.
I like the Malcolm Gladwell book, The Tipping Point, if everyone hasn't read that. That's a great one that talks about that, how changes occur. But to your point about urgency, I think you're right. I think figuring out how to get that sort of sense of urgency, and the article talks about sometimes companies bring somebody in from the outside to set it, because if you can't hear it from the inside, you can sometimes hear it from the outside. And I don't know figuring out how to do that, I think, is the difficult part. And I have to say, on my own little piece of the world, I have a hard time figuring out how to lay out the sense of urgency without it coming off as, I'm complaining, I'm too direct, I'm too this, I'm just seeing all the faults. So it's messaging it in the right way so that people hear it and receive it, not just shut it off.
So I have a question for all of you because this is sort of self-disclosure time. So as one of Banner's leaders here in Colorado, I sometimes feel very much the urgency for something, but I will not necessarily transmit the urgency, and I invite you to guess why some of those reasons might be. Come on, be brave. Take a whack at it. I mean, obviously, I'm not doing clinical anymore. I'll tell you that. And I think the number one reason that we as leaders sometimes even fail that urgency one day is that we get enveloped in so many activities. And I hate to tell you all this, but the reality is that you're all leaders. You're very, very strong in that, or you wouldn't be on the phone call. The problem is that once you're identified as a leader, you got to really manage your schedule and budget because your urgency can only be divided up into so many projects.
Well, and I think, Sheldon, this is Doug Cutler. Also, you have to manage the urgency of things because you can only say the sky is falling so many times, and it really may be falling, but you have to grade which ones are the most severe or triage the most serious issues from other ones. It's hard when they're, and I think with this ACO and everything, there are so many changes rapidly firing that people get kind of numb to it.
Good point, Doug.
Yeah, this is Ann. I was going to say similarly to what Doug was pointing out, there's the information weariness. There's, the confusion that goes along with it. Doctors of my generation tend to be very autonomous, and so anytime folks from administrative perch are preaching, I think there's often a response to kind of fold their arms and say, not me, I'm not going to get pushed or told what to do.
So one of the other things I would suggest to you that you're probably already experiencing or have, and that is that, at least for me in a call rotation, and just relationships with your partners, it is taboo to dump work on your partners. I mean, you just don't do that. You don't, in my office as an internist, we got very frustrated with one of our docs and put pressure on him until he finally actually left. And it was, he'd order all his INRs and he would never call them back. And of course, family's calling at night, and so we were doing his work for him. And so you never, to dump on your partners is pretty bad. When you get in a leadership role, it really is important to appropriately delegate. And some of the urgency is probably solved with lots of things to do by sitting with someone saying, would you be willing to lead this project? And you give them, time to think about it. They come back and say, I'd really like to do it. And then somewhere you may have to have a conversation with them and say, okay, here's the latest thing we need. And I have to tell you, we really do, this is urgent. We really do need this to probably happen by a week from Friday. Is that something you're on board with? Can you do that? And that's how you can manage more things, but you have to then mentor and support them. But it is okay to delegate, but I will tell you, it's one of the hardest things for me still to do.
I think in that line of being busy, too, when you look at management and leadership, a lot of leaders have to spend a lot of their time managing. And then it's hard to be a leader when you're still having to do all the operational stuff and the management stuff that can just, eat up your whole day.
Yeah, and I think that's part of the fail. I think that's why systems, that makes sense. I mean, I had personally never studied it, but that makes sense. It makes sense when your time is taken away by the nuances and the details and the structure, you lose the sight of where it is you're going. And I think there has to be some constant reminder in all mediums that we come across that tells everybody, all stakeholders, where is it that you're going, whether at the beginning of the day, the end of the day, beginning of the week, end of the week, whatever it is. At some point you need to recognize that we are all going in one direction, and that direction is very clear and everyone knows it. Until we know that, I think you're going to constantly be faced with unknowns and uncertainties and not full buy-in.
Well, I'll just be the devil's advocate and say none of us know where we're going. Everybody thinks they know, but they don't know at all, and that's just part of life. We try to control it by saying this is where we're going, but tomorrow we might have to go the other direction, and so there's always going to be that sense of uncertainty. But I think I like the part that says that jumping off the cliff feels better than staying where you are. So. That's what you have to get people to feel.
This is Kevin McKay, but I think you have to convince people that the change is inevitable and is needed, and I think that's what I perceive to be the biggest problem out there is a lot of people aren't convinced that things really do need to change or that they are going to change, and I think they're comfortable where they're at and they're willing to just sit it out as long as they can until it becomes obvious that they're going to have to come on board. I think most physicians do respond quite well once they become convinced that there's a change of direction is needed and it's going to affect them, financially or, with patient volume or whatever. I've worked at several different banner hospitals that have different physician makeups, and I've noticed that, for instance, at at Gateway and MD Anderson, where you've got a high percentage of employed physicians, people come on board a lot quicker for this kind of stuff and respond, and I think they're more quickly recognizing that the change is inevitable and that they're going to have to move on it. Whereas in some of the other hospitals where there's just a large percentage of people who are not employed, they're not willing to move until they're just absolutely convinced they have to. So, one focus actually to make this happen might be to focus on the hospitals that are more likely to respond and get them to respond and then show what the difference is, with the hospitals who are not. It's just a suggestion.
That's a great idea because not only are you using an entire complex structure as a champion of that change, you're doing it and you're doing it successfully. I think that can get buy-in from others who are naysayers or complacent about what the change is going to be.
This is Charlie Agee, and I was out with some physicians Sunday, and they were asking me, Charlie, really, is all this change really going to make an effect? What does 14 bring? What does 15 bring? And do we really need to get on board? And they were actually from 3 different banner facilities. And, one of the areas I just kind of try to push is I say, regardless of the Affordable Care Act or what's happening across the country or the exchanges, et cetera, there's no question Banner, at least at this point, wants to have 1.2 million lives at risk within 5 years. So inevitably, Banner is going to be changing, and that equates to an awful lot of lives, whether it's ambulatory, facility, post-acute, within the greater Phoenix area. So absolutely no question, you need to start listening, you need to be engaged, you need to start figuring out how you can improve in your ambulatory practice as well as your facility practice, or, what area. And I think sometimes just I like using that 1.2 million lives. I go by 2017, guys, and we're already in 2013. So think about how that could impact you. Where are you aligned? Are you going to be one of our high-value networks? Do you want to make sure you're aligned so you can be part of that? Or do you want to be employed? Or do you want to be contracted with us so that you're totally in the mix? I think it's beneficial to try to put no ifs, ands, or buts. Change is there.
Hi, this is Dr. Khan. Great comment. I just suddenly gave me an idea of, about establishing a sense of urgency. And we all know that it is, an important task to make everybody understand. But as a leader, how do you make people believe and follow you? And, we talk about intelligence, and we say, well, physicians are pretty intelligent, but it's kind of a generic term for more of an IQ. We do a pretty good job of, commonly referred to as an analytical intelligence, but getting that across, where it's more referred to as a kind of emotional intelligence, or you connect with people, or you just, you use the emotions to convey your message, or how do you manage those? And then getting the culture to understand where the leadership commonly referred to as cultural intelligence. because there's a lot of cultural differences among different disciplines, including physicians, surgeons, intensivists, internists, and everybody may have a different cultural mindset. So I think when we talk about a change in establishing a sense of urgency, we not only have to understand the problem internally, which probably we are good at, but getting that across and making it more of an emotional issue, like you mentioned about millions of lives being affected, and then getting everybody ready to accept that new culture. So if you look at it in a three-dimensional view, that understanding a problem is relatively easy. That's our analytical intelligence, but getting everybody emotionally involved and then culturally adopt it, that's the task we have to work on.
So going back to this this slide that you guys should have up there, organizations need both, but most are overmanaged and underled. Do you agree with this? Is there anybody that disagrees with this statement that's being made? So by silence, I'm assuming that means agreement. And if there is agreement, why do we continue to create more managers? Why, as organizations, do we continue to make positions and flourish these positions rather than the opposite, rather than focusing on making more leaders? Or are we doing that? And again, my question here is with the supposition that management is a man-made thing. We created management. I don't think management existed. We created it. And now that we've created it, and it seems to make sense, why do we continue?
The article points out that management is necessary. I mean, it is a necessary function in order to survive, as a business. I think the key is to try to identify among your managers people that have vision and try to build those up and go with it.
I think we make more managers because it's concrete. It's black and white. It's easy to do. And leadership is much more hazy and gray, and you can't quite put your finger on it. Sometimes when there's a big elephant in the room, people focus on the fly because you can catch and kill the fly and you can't do anything about the elephant. And management to me is somewhat like that. You can put everything in order, but you might not necessarily be able to fix the problem.
And Shiva, I would say that in addition to maybe we don't hire enough leaders, the other problem that leads to over-management and under-leadership is that we put people in leadership roles, and either we haven't picked the right people or we haven't supported them, and so they turn into managers. So you've got them in place to lead, and they're not able to do it. It takes a lot of learning how to get rid of your ego. I think one of the most complimentary things that one could ever hear about a leader might go something like this. So I'll pick on Charlie because he's on the phone and he's a partner of mine. But have you all noticed that Charlie's divisions that he leads for the last 5 years they've been like number one? But here's what I don't get: he never does anything, and that's actually probably the highest compliment a leader could get. Because if it's not seeing what they're doing, then they're not out front micromanaging all these people. What they're doing is they're spending time, as you've already said on the call, all of you, you're mentoring, you're coaching, you're giving in, you're behind closed doors. After the end of the day, you're just saying, hey, listen, it's another defeat, but you know what? There's more wins than defeats, and you had to try it. So you're encouraging, but it doesn't. On the front lines, it doesn't look like you're doing much, and that's because you're not over managing. You're leading.
I think another issue, too, is with leadership or vision, there's risk involved. And often it means taking chances and trying to move into a direction where you're not quite sure where it's going to go. And you could fail. And, that could have negative consequences depending on what organization you're in or who you're leading. And so, I think some people are afraid of taking that risk, and it's just a lot easier to be in a management position where everything is structural and you understand exactly what you're doing and what you're aiming at.
That's kind of what I was saying.
Excellent points. I do agree completely. I think both absolutely are needed because they serve completely different purposes. But they're not interreplaceable, and that's where the gap is. I think what Sheldon you're suggesting is probably true, where people are in positions of leadership that evolve into becoming managers, and there's others that are not in those positions that need to develop into leaders for us to move forward. I think the recognition has to come at every level of the organization to find out where we're lacking in areas of leadership. What is the areas that are in greatest need of leadership? And as an organization, and this might be at every level, we need to push that change. We need to push that change to get good leaders in those positions and remove the barriers that prevent those leaders from working, whether they're the structure of how things exist or they're people that are the barriers to that change.
You know, I'd like to make one point. This is Dr. Haddad. Is that having too much leadership without management skills also may lead to failure. And the reason being, you know, it's all the vision is there, but then the details are not taken care of and things fail. That's what I have observed recently in one of the projects that we have. You know, there was so much leadership there, but the details were not paid attention to and things did not work out.
You have to have someone to carry out the details. I took a leadership course once, and we did this thing where they divided what your preferences were, and you then had a characteristic. You were either a visionary person, or a detail person, or a person who liked to smooth everything over, or a person who did everything on their own. And then they told us that most presidents were the visionaries or the details. But you think about the visionaries like Reagan and Roosevelt and Kennedy. Like, they surrounded themselves. They had these big visions, but they were successful because they surrounded themselves by the detail people to carry out the vision.
Good point. So my question is it also make sense to have somebody with a balance, and this will be the most successful person, and one having both characteristics? Is that you know, desirable qualities, or not necessarily?
I think it's hard to have somebody who has the balance, because it's hard to have the 10,000-foot view and the microscopic view.
Yeah, I mean, some of these are very fundamental to someone's personality, someone's style, someone's way of being, and some of this is learned. But I do think managers can learn to be leaders. I think leadership is a skill that can be learned. I don't think it's all natural and you have it or you don't have it. I think that's the whole purpose of the ALP course, is to identify some individuals and push leadership principles along. And I think it is something that can be learned. So maybe there is a mix of the two. That's the best case scenario. But,
or at least recognizing what your strengths are and supplementing your opportunities with people who have the strengths that you don't. I mean, I think.
Has anybody on the call done the Hogan, or have all of you guys done the Hogan personality profile?
Yes.
Yes.
So, you know, again, I'm assuming most of you have done it. I found that to be a phenomenal tool for identifying something like this. And we did that here at the Cancer Center amongst all the division chiefs, and we all had our Hogans done at the same time, and we found that we all had unique personality traits, and they were, in some sense, very complementary, and in some sense, they were, you know, replaceable. And I thought that was a very good way where you could see what a team's strength is and how to pull it all together. I don't think tools like that are used often enough at multiple levels within an organization for several reasons. Obviously, they're very expensive and resource consuming. But tools like that help you identify who is it that is best at doing something, because everybody can't be best at doing everything.
But if you're in tune enough with having done those kind of tests, the Hogan, the Myers-Briggs, or whatever it is, then you can start to see as a leader traits in other people who have things that you need for your project, even without them doing the thing. And I think that it's sort of, then you become the super user of the Hogan, and you can disperse it without people even having to do the Hogan to kind of put teams together.
And remember that leaders can figure that out, and they learn what they're not good at, and rather than sort of feeling bad about it, they hire and surround themselves with people who are good at it. But it also requires that stepping out of a somewhat more traditional manager's role, which is I feel threatened by people who aren't like me, so I hire people just like me, which means that you've got a lot of blind spots.
Which happens all the time.
But
it happens way too often.
Just to kind of push what Sheldon's saying, this is Charlie again, and to Shiva's your comment on the Hogan, I think it becomes, as you get in more leadership roles, you really do understand your strengths and weaknesses, and you start to find teams that you can work with. And unfortunately, sometimes you ask an awful lot from a lot of different team members across the system, because you learn how they can complement you, and then you do end up being very successful, or can become very successful because they put the complement together to be successful. And that's one of the things as a leader. You don't have to know and do all. What you have to figure out is how can you put that complement together to have everyone work and then deliver on the final component.
One thing I'd like to just throw out to you guys, I know we're running out of time, but it's you share the painful scars you have, but I've hinted to you all that in my early leadership I spent an awful lot of time in conflict solving it, and then when I couldn't, I didn't realize I was resorting to authority, and as they say, authority is a very poor substitute for leadership, and that never goes well. And I took a course on change management, and the question they asked the entire class, of which I was a member, is if you'd ever had a boss or a supervisor that asked you to do something that was just totally stupid. Universally, we said, yeah, we've had that experience, and they asked us to think about it and the kind of thoughts we had about the person asking us that, and we kind of created that in our mind. And then they said, now I want you to put yourself in that other person's position, whether they were right or not in what they were asking of you. Okay, what's your point? We can do that. It's just, were you a resistor? And we all realized that if you can somehow take the perspective of the person, whether they're right or not on what they're asking you to do, how we must have appeared to that person. And we obviously were the people we've grown to hate, the people who resist us when we're leading. And we have all been resistors before. And, particularly if you're leading an initiative that's not yet proven, I'm sure you're going to have a healthy number of people who think you're an idiot. And the whole exercise was just to get us to better understand how to connect with people who are resisting with us, and imagine we've been in that role. What would have worked for us? What might they be thinking that isn't ridiculous? The fears, the personal stakes that they may be putting in it, and it did help a little bit. I think I'd love to say it was a breakthrough course. I think it comes bit by bit by bit, but it did help understand what to do with folks when you're leading, particularly change, and they don't want to follow.
Great. Excellent comment. Thanks, Sheldon. Let's kind of get to closing this since we got just a couple minutes left. Excellent conversation. Thank you very much for everybody for joining in. Any closing comments towards the articles and whether you are or are not going to apply anything from these going forward? Okay. Well, I, for one...
well, here, I'll say one, Shiva. This is Charlie again. Whether each article you read or each kind of component you look at from a leadership standpoint, sometimes you take in more than you actually realize you do. And as you start to work with your team in any facility or with your family or in some of your outside activities, you actually will utilize these small changes that you've picked up where you don't even really realize you have started to take these teachings that you've started to take into your brain and assimilate, and you're moving forward, and a good percentage of the time you won't even notice that. It's the people around you that start to notice the big changes.
Excellent. Well, I for one, for me, the biggest thing is, there's people very smart and very well trained who have entire jobs and careers at looking at this. So when people are yelling and screaming at why don't they get it, why don't they change, at least it makes me feel good that this is well studied and there's entire organizations that get hired for this purpose. So it's hard. This is difficult, and I think we're all faced with this challenge every day. I don't think all of our changes are transformational, but I think going forward, it's something that we should take into consideration. I think these steps are a tool in our bag, but by no means are an answer. But again, I thank you all very much. The recording for this will be available online. If you have any other comments or suggestions, please feel free to comment online or email or whatever works. And thank you for your time.
Thank you, Shiva.
Bye. Thanks, Shiva.
Bye-bye, everybody.
The chairperson has left the conference. The conference will end